Late autumn. Twilight settled over the high plains of New Mexico, where the wind dragged long fingers of dust across the empty horizon. The prairie grass bent low beneath a blood-red sky, and the world felt hollow, waiting for something to break. Out on the edge of that silence rode a rancher named Eli Tanner. His coat was worn thin at the shoulders, hat brim pulled low, boots cracked from years of hard living. A man with no family, no fortune, only a small patch of land clinging to the desert like it might blow away if the wind pressed harder. His horse snorted against the cold dusk air, and Eli's eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the trail ahead. That was when he saw him, a lone figure staggering in the half-light, cloak torn and spattered with blood, boots dragging through the sand. The man looked less like a traveler and more like a corpse, walking his face hollow, eyes wild, clutching at a saddlebag slung across one shoulder. Then he fell, hard, face first into the dirt, a sound like a sack of stones hitting the earth. Eli drew his rifle without thinking, every muscle tight. The prairie didn't give up strangers lightly, not without reason. Coyotes howled somewhere out in the rim of the dark, circling the scent of weakness. The man stirred, coughing, hand reaching not for water but for iron. A revolver gleamed in the last shred of daylight as he tried to drag it free, before collapsing again with a groan. Eli dismounted slowly, rifle steady. He didn't yet know if this was a desperate outlaw, a dying soldier, or something worse, but he knew one thing. Helping this man might cost him everything. Still, against the silence of the desert and the pull of his own hard nature, Eli Tanner stepped closer. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The stranger did not die that night. Eli Tanner dragged him into the low-beamed ranch house, laid him across a straw mattress, and stoked the fire high enough to chase off the desert chill that gnawed bone deep after sundown. The man's breath was ragged, his face pale as tallow, but his grip on that battered saddlebag never slackened. Even unconscious, his fingers clutched it tight, as though it was worth more than life itself. Eli watched from the chair by the hearth, rifle propped across his knees. He was a man who had spent years learning when to trust and when to shoot, and he had not yet decided which road this stranger belonged on. The wind outside howled against the shutters, dust sifting in like smoke, and each gust carried the coyote's hungry cry closer. Somewhere in the rattling darkness, fate seemed to circle his ranch. By morning, the man stirred. His eyes opened sharp, restless, the color of cold steel. He tried to rise, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed back against the bedding with a hiss of pain. Eli stepped closer, hand on the butt of his revolver. "You're safe enough here," Eli said, voice low and flat. "But safe don't come cheap." The stranger's cracked lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "I'll pay." Not in coin, but in truth. His voice was a rasp, like gravel ground under a wagon wheel. He coughed hard, then winced. "Just don't throw me back to the dust." Eli should have turned him out then. Should have saddled up and ridden into town, let the sheriff deal with whatever trouble this broken figure carried on his shoulders. But something older than reason kept him rooted, the memory of too many cold nights spent alone, too many times when kindness had passed him by. So Eli fetched water, bread, and a strip of dried beef. The stranger ate like a starving wolf, each bite a struggle, eyes never leaving Eli's. When he was done, he leaned back, sweat glistening at his temple. "Name's Caleb," he said finally, voice steadier now. "I owe you my life." Eli gave no reply. Out on the plains, names didn't mean much until deeds proved them. Instead, he glanced at the saddlebag. Caleb followed his gaze, his hand tightening over it. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, fear, or maybe shame. Then he turned his face toward the fire. The day wore on. Eli put Caleb to work as soon as he could stand, handing him a bucket, then a pitchfork, watching carefully how he moved. Caleb staggered, stumbled, but he didn't complain. Each task seemed to burn away a little more of his weakness, though his silence stayed heavy as lead. Word spread quick through town. By the end of the week, folks were already whispering in the saloon that Eli Tanner had taken in a drifter, a wounded man no one knew, no one trusted. The shopkeeper raised his brow when Eli bought extra provisions. The blacksmith muttered under his breath when Caleb followed behind him into town, his hat brim pulled low. One night, after supper, Eli caught Caleb trying to saddle his horse under the cover of darkness. He stood in the doorway, rifle loose in his hands, the lamplight spilling across the yard. "You aim to leave without a word?" Eli asked. Caleb froze, jaw tight. "I can't stay here, not with what's chasing me." Eli stepped forward, the dust crunching under his boots. "Then it'll chase you, or it'll chase me. Either way, it's here already. You brought it." For a long time, Caleb said nothing. Then, with a shudder, he dropped the reins. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of the desert itself pressed down. "You don't understand, Tanner. I've carried something across 100 miles of dust and death, and it's not just mine. It belongs to men who'll kill for it." The words hung heavy in the cold night air. Eli felt the truth of them settle in his gut like lead. The stranger wasn't just a guest anymore, he was a burden Eli could not shrug off. Fate had laid it on his shoulders, and there was no walking away. So Eli holstered his rifle and stepped closer, his voice low and final. "Then we'll face it here. My land, my rules. You stay, and whatever's coming, we'll meet it together." In that moment, Eli Tanner knew he had taken on more than a starving man. He had taken on a storm, and storms, in the Wild West, never passed quietly. The storm did not come with thunder first, it came with whispers. By the time the sun rose over the high plains, folks in town had already sharpened their tongues against Eli Tanner's name. He felt it the moment he rode in with Caleb behind him. The main street, usually slow with morning chores, seemed to pause. A woman fetching water from a barrel stopped mid-pour, eyes fixed on the stranger with Eli. The blacksmith's hammer hung in the air, striking an anvil late. Children peered from behind posts and wagons, their mothers pulling them back with tight hands. Eli rode on, jaw set. Caleb's hat brim pulled so low, his face was a shadow. But shadows don't stay hidden long in a place where every man's worth is measured at the saloon door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. Eli pushed through, boots echoing on the warped boards. He asked for flour, salt, a tin of coffee. The shopkeeper leaned across the counter, lips curled like he'd bitten sour fruit. "Heard you got yourself a new hand out there, Tanner," the man said, voice loud enough to catch ears. "Funny thing, don't recall him riding into town by the front road. More like he crawled out the dust, didn't he?" A few chuckles rose from the corners of the room. Cowboys playing cards paused to watch. Caleb stiffened, his hand flexing near the counter. Eli laid a palm flat against the wood. "Steady." "He's with me," Eli said. His voice carried the weight of a man who didn't give room for argument. But in towns like this, words were sparks. And sparks found kindling quick. By evening, the whispers had grown into talk of Tanner wasting what little fortune he had on a drifter bound to bring trouble. They said kindness was weakness, and weakness invited wolves. 2 nights later, Eli and Caleb walked into the saloon. Conversation dropped like a stone into a well. The piano man let his fingers hover over the keys, unsure whether to play or run. A broad-shouldered cowboy, drunk and eager for sport, leaned from his chair. "Hey, stranger," he slurred, eyes narrowing at Caleb. "You hiding under that hat 'cause you're wanted somewhere? Or just ashamed of the company you keep?" Laughter rippled, mean and sharp. Caleb froze, knuckles whitening at his side. Eli stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "Leave it," he said. But the cowboy wasn't listening. He rose, knocking over his chair, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. His fist swung wide, catching Caleb across the jaw. Caleb staggered back, slamming against the bar. The saloon roared to life, men cheering, boots stomping, fists pounding tables. Eli moved fast. He shoved between them, but another man lunged, grabbing Caleb by the collar. The fight spilled, glass shattering, fists flying, chairs toppling. Eli swung his rifle like a club, knocking a man clean to the floor. Caleb fought with desperate fury, wild and unpolished, each strike born of survival more than skill. When it was over, the saloon lay in ruins of broken glass and blood. The 2 men stood back to back, chests heaving, eyes scanning the circle of cowboys now keeping their distance. The sheriff finally pushed through the crowd, hand resting heavy on his revolver. His gaze landed on Caleb, then on Eli. "Tanner," he said coldly, "this man you're harboring, he's trouble. Everyone can see it. You best send him packing before it's too late." But Eli didn't answer. He looked at Caleb, blood trickling from his lip, and saw something there, something familiar. Not just trouble, not just danger, but a man carrying a weight too heavy for one back alone. Eli turned, met the sheriff's eyes, and spoke so the whole saloon could hear. "He stays." The words rolled through the room like distant thunder, and with them, Eli Tanner marked himself not just against the men in that saloon, but against the whole town. From that night on, the ranch wasn't just his burden, it was his battleground. The days that followed were quieter, but only on the surface. The town still spat its judgment in whispers, the sheriff's warning still hung heavy in the air. Yet out on Eli Tanner's ranch, something shifted. The land itself seemed to demand labor, and labor had a way of binding men together. At dawn, Eli woke Caleb with a kick of his boot heel against the bunk frame. "Sun's up. Fence won't mend itself." Caleb groaned, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, then pulled on his hat without complaint. They set out across the dry pasture, the horizon pale gold, prairie winds tugging at their coats. Caleb's hands blistered quick, soft skin split raw against the wire. But he kept at it, jaw clenched, sweat darkening his shirt. Eli worked beside him, silent, steady, watching how the man refused to quit, though the sun burned cruel and the dust choked their throats. By sundown, Caleb's palms bled, yet he drove the last stake deep into the ground without a word. That night, Eli poured whiskey into 2 tin cups. He slid one across the table. Caleb stared at it for a long time before taking it, raising it in a silent salute. For the first time, Eli saw not just a drifter in his home, but a man fighting to prove himself. Days bled into weeks. Together they hauled water from the well, repaired the barn roof, herded cattle across the brittle grass. At first, their words were few, scattered like dry leaves in the wind. But as the chores wore on, they spoke more about the weather, the cattle market, the stubborn streak of Eli's old horse. Small things, the kind that softened silence. One evening, after a long day's ride, they camped near the river. The water caught the last light of the dying sun, glowing like a strip of molten copper. Caleb sat with his boots in the sand, staring at the current. His voice was low, rough. "I had a brother once," he said. "We rode together, fought together, till I chose a path he didn't. Cost him his life." His hand traced the scar across his chest, a pale ridge that caught the firelight. "I've been running ever since." Eli didn't reply at once. He let the river speak, let the fire crackle. Then he said, "Running don't bury the past. Only thing that does is facing it." His eyes stayed on the flames, but his words carried weight. Caleb's gaze flicked toward him, searching, measuring. For a moment, the walls between them thinned, and Eli saw not just a fugitive, but a man hollowed by loss, desperate for redemption. The next morning, Caleb rose early. When Eli stepped out, he found him already working the corral, sweat glistening as he wrestled a half-broken Mustang. Dust swirled, hooves thundered, and the horse reared high, nearly throwing him. But Caleb held on, teeth bared, muscles straining until the animal finally bowed its head, shuddering beneath his grip. Eli leaned on the fence rail, watching, a faint spark of respect in his weathered eyes. At supper that night, the silence between them felt different, lighter, almost companionable. Eli found himself telling a story he hadn't spoken in years. About the winter he nearly lost his herd to snow. About the wife he'd buried on this land before her time. Caleb listened, not interrupting, not pitying, just listening. It was in those small moments that trust began to root itself, fragile but real. The town still scorned, the sheriff still circled like a hawk, but inside the ranch house walls, the weight of suspicion eased. And yet, even as the bond grew, both men knew the past had not released its grip. Caleb's saddlebag still lay tucked in the corner, untouched, a silent reminder of secrets heavy enough to draw blood. But for now, in the quiet strength of shared labor and scarred confessions, They found something neither had known in years: brotherhood. The prairie winds carried the scent of rain, and with it, the promise that storms were coming. The storm broke not with rain, but with fire. It was midnight when Eli Tanner jolted awake to the smell of smoke. At first he thought it was a dream, the kind that haunted long, lonely nights. But then came the crackle, the roar, and the sudden scream of horses thrashing in the corral. Eli threw open the door, and the night exploded red. His barn was ablaze, flames clawing high into the sky, sparks carried wild on the wind. "Caleb!" Eli roared. The stranger was already moving, boots pounding across the dirt, face lit by the inferno. They reached the barn together, heat blasting their skin. Eli yanked the gate wide, slapping at terrified horses as they bolted into the night. Caleb fought with a burning rope, his hands seared as he freed the last mare. But then came the gunfire. Shadows burst from the darkness, masked riders, rifles flashing in the firelight. The raiders had come like wolves, using the blaze as their cover. Bullets tore through the night, wood splintered, dust churned with blood. Eli dove behind a water trough, rifle in hand, returning fire. Caleb staggered back against the corral fence, revolver blazing, every shot a desperate cry. The raiders pressed hard, their faces half hidden but their intent clear. They weren't here for cattle. They were here for Caleb. The saddlebag. It still lay inside the ranch house, and Eli understood in that instant the secret Caleb carried had drawn this hell to his land. "Go!" Caleb shouted over the roar of flames. "They want me, not you." But Eli Tanner was not a man to cut and run. He bared his teeth, fired again, and dropped a rider clean from his saddle. The man hit the dirt, didn't rise. Another charged, a torch in hand, hurling it through the ranch house window. The glass shattered, and in seconds Eli's home was burning too. The night turned into chaos. Horses screamed, fire roared, gunpowder split the air. Eli and Caleb fought back to back, smoke choking their lungs, sparks scorching their skin. Caleb went down once, a bullet grazing his shoulder, but Eli dragged him up, shoved a rifle into his hands. They made a stand in the corral, 2 men against a pack, the fire painting them as silhouettes carved from ash and fury. For a moment, it almost seemed possible they dropped raider after raider, grit and rage carrying them through. But numbers win battles, and the raiders kept coming. A shot rang out. Eli cried out, falling to one knee, blood soaking his side. Caleb turned, eyes wild, firing until his pistol clicked empty. He swung it like a club, cracked a raider's jaw, ripped the man's rifle free, and kept fighting. But still, the tide pressed harder. The barn collapsed behind them with a deafening crash, sparks raining down like stars. The heat seared their skin, and the world narrowed to survival. Eli's vision blurred, his breath ragged, but he heard Caleb's voice through the chaos, furious, desperate, unbroken. "Get up, Tanner, don't you D on me now." Together, bloodied and burned, they fought their way through the storm of fire and iron. By the time the last raider fled into the night, the ranch was gone, nothing left but blackened beams and smoldering ruin. Eli Tanner sank to the dirt, his rifle slipping from his grasp, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. Caleb knelt beside him, hands shaking, smoke curling from his torn clothes. Around them, the night was silent again, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. They had survived. But survival was not victory. Everything Eli had built lay in ashes, and the secret Caleb carried had just burned its way into both their lives forever. Smoke lingered for days after the fire, a bitter haze that clung to the hills and seeped into every breath. Eli Tanner stood amid the ruin, ribs bound tight, blood still crusted at his side. His house was ash, his barn a pile of blackened beams. The wind that once rattled his shutters now carried only the crackle of dying embers. Caleb stood near him, shoulder bandaged, eyes hollow. He hadn't spoken much since the fight. The saddlebag, the weight that had dragged hell upon them, sat between them on the scorched earth. For the first time, Eli saw Caleb reach inside. He pulled out not gold, nor stolen treasure, but a leather-bound ledger, pages scarred by weather and blood. Names filled its lines, men of power, men who had built their fortunes on cruelty and theft. Caleb had carried the proof of their crimes across deserts and mountains, hunted at every turn. That was his secret, his burden. "I ran because I thought I was alone," Caleb said, voice breaking against the silence. "But I'm done running." Eli said nothing. He only placed a hand on the man's shoulder, weathered palm to weary flesh. It was a small gesture, yet it bound them stronger than blood. 6 months later, spring washed the plains in green. Where ash once lay, shoots of wheat pushed stubbornly toward the sky. Eli's ranch, though scarred, rose again, walls rebuilt with rough timber, a roof hammered into place by calloused hands. Caleb had stayed, though no words had been spoken about it. He worked from dawn until the stars burned white, his labor a penance, his presence a promise. The town changed slowly. At first, folks passed by in silence, their eyes heavy with suspicion. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. When Eli rode in with supplies, no one whispered. When Caleb helped mend a neighbor's fence after a storm, men nodded, silent but approving. Respect wasn't given all at once, it was earned nail by nail, acre by acre. One evening, a small crowd gathered on the Tanner ranch. The sun dipped low, painting the land gold. Eli stood with hammer in hand, Caleb beside him as they raised the final beam into place on the barn. Before the timber was set, Eli carved something into it with the tip of his knife. 2 names, side by side. Tanner, Caleb. They lifted the beam together, shoulders straining, arms trembling, until it locked into place above them. A cheer rose from the few neighbors who had come to help, their voices rolling across the prairie like thunder after drought. It was not just a barn that stood there now, it was a mark of survival, a monument to brotherhood. As dusk deepened, Eli lit a lantern and hung it high at the barn's peak. Its glow cut across the dark, a beacon for miles, a symbol that the ranch still lived, still fought, still stood. Caleb watched the light with a long breath, then reached into his coat. From his pocket, he pulled a small silver medallion, tarnished but shining in the firelight. He pressed it into Eli's hand. "It belonged to my brother," Caleb said quietly. "I carried it to remind me of what I lost. Tonight, I give it to you, to remind me of what I found." But Eli closed his fist around the medallion, eyes never leaving Caleb's. He didn't speak, he never needed to. The silence between them carried more weight than words. By the year's turn, the land had flourished again. Cattle grazed the pastures, wheat bent heavy under the summer wind, and the ranch rang with the sound of hammers and laughter from neighbors who now came not to mock, but to share a hand. The town had shifted, too, Caleb, no longer a shadow, but a man who walked the street without flinching. Still, on quiet nights, Eli would sit on the porch, the medallion glinting in the lantern light, his gaze on the horizon. He knew storms would come again, storms always did, but he also knew that no man stood alone against them, not anymore. And when the wind carried the sound of coyotes across the hills, Eli Tanner only tightened his grip on the medallion and whispered to the night, "We survived." If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.